So today I want to talk about something that most people are completely missing about the crisis that is unfolding right now in the global economy. Everyone remembers 2008. Everyone remembers the bank failures, the collapsing stock markets, the emergency government bailouts, the headlines about the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. That was a genuine catastrophe. It cost millions of people their jobs, their homes, and their savings. But almost nobody is asking the question that actually matters most right now. The question that determines whether your pension holds its value, whether your job is still there in 5 years, whether your government can keep funding the services you depend on, whether your children will inherit a stable economy or a broken one. That question is this: is the crisis building right now, slowly, quietly, without the dramatic single moment of collapse that 2008 had, actually larger, deeper, and harder to escape than anything we faced in 2008? Not because of a single bank failing, not because of one reckless sector taking down the system, but because the very foundations that allowed us to recover from 2008, the cheap money, the government borrowing capacity, the functioning global trade system, and the institutional trust, those foundations are themselves now under stress. In 2008, the house caught fire. Governments ran in with fire hoses. They flooded the building with cheap money and borrowed their way to stability. And it worked for a while. But the water from those fire hoses soaked into the foundations. And now the foundations are soft, and the next fire has no easy answer. The first thing you need to understand, the single idea that makes everything else in this video make sense, is the difference between a crisis of the financial system and a crisis of the economic foundations beneath it. 2008 was a crisis of the financial system. The trigger was specific and identifiable. A bubble in American housing amplified by reckless mortgage lending, packaged into complex financial instruments that nobody fully understood, and distributed throughout the global banking system. When housing prices fell, those instruments became worthless, banks that held them became insolvent, and the credit that lubricates the entire global economy froze almost overnight. It was catastrophic, but it was also fixable in the sense that governments and central banks knew broadly what levers to pull, cut interest rates to zero, and inject liquidity into frozen credit markets, guarantee bank deposits, bail out systemically important institutions, borrow and spend to replace the private demand that had collapsed. It was expensive, it was messy, and it stored up future problems, but the toolkit existed and it worked. What is building now is different in a way that most financial commentary has not yet adequately explained. It is not a crisis of one sector or one instrument or one country's reckless behavior. It is a crisis of the conditions that made the 2008 recovery possible. Interest rates are no longer near zero. They cannot be cut to zero again without reigniting the inflation that caused so much damage. Governments are no longer carrying manageable debt. They borrowed so heavily to manage 2008 and then the pandemic that many are now carrying debt levels that constrain their ability to borrow further. And the institutional trust in the systems that coordinate global economic responses is fraying precisely when that trust is most needed. The question is no longer whether the global economy faces serious structural stress. It does. The question is which economies entered this period with enough resilience, enough fiscal space, enough energy security, enough institutional strength to navigate what is coming without severe damage to ordinary people's lives. On the surface, America looks like the country best equipped to manage any crisis. The world's largest economy and the issuer of the global reserve currency, a technology sector without equal, an energy sector that has made it effectively self-sufficient. History has shown repeatedly that America's capacity to adapt and recover is greater than almost any other nation on earth. But underneath that formidable surface, America is entering this crisis with constraints that it did not have in 2008, and that significantly limit its ability to respond the way it did then. In 2008, America's national debt stood at approximately $10 trillion. Today it stands at $34 trillion, more than 3 times higher. In 2008, the Federal Reserve's benchmark interest rate was around 4% when the crisis hit, giving it room to cut dramatically. Today, rates have been elevated to fight inflation, and any significant cut risks reigniting the price pressures that have already damaged household finances across the country. In 2008, America's annual interest payments on its debt were manageable. Today, at over $1 trillion per year, interest payments consume more of the federal budget than defense, and are on a trajectory to become the single largest budget line within a decade. What this means practically is that the fire hose America used in 2008, the combination of near-zero rates and massive government borrowing, is not fully available this time. The hose still exists, but the water pressure is lower and the tank is not full. For ordinary American families, this plays out in very specific ways. Higher mortgage rates that are not coming down quickly. Credit card interest rates above 20% that are quietly transferring wealth from households to financial institutions. Every month, a government that is financially less capable of cushioning the economic transitions being driven by artificial intelligence, deindustrialization, and energy reshuffling. Precisely when those transitions are accelerating, America will manage. It has too many structural advantages not to, but the management will be more painful, more contested, and more consequential for ordinary people than the 2008 recovery was. On the surface, Europe looks like a stable, mature economic bloc, strong institutions, democratic governance, a common currency across 20 nations, and deep financial markets. A highly educated, highly skilled workforce. Europe has managed serious crises before. The Eurozone debt crisis of 2010 to 2015, the 2008 shock, the energy disruption of 2022, and it has survived each one. But underneath that record of survival, Europe is entering the current period with less economic room than at any point since the Second World War. Italy, the Eurozone's third largest economy, carries government debt at 140% of its GDP. France has crossed 110%. Greece, which nearly brought down the Eurozone in 2012, has not resolved its underlying debt dynamics. At current interest rates, the cost of servicing these debts is rising faster than the economies themselves are growing. When debt costs grow faster than GDP, the fiscal mathematics become progressively harder to manage and progressively more politically volatile. Germany, Europe's economic engine, and the country that has historically underwritten Eurozone stability, is itself in an industrial recession. Its manufacturing model, built on cheap Russian energy and open Chinese markets, has lost both of those structural advantages simultaneously. German industrial output has declined for 2 consecutive years. Investment is leaving Germany for the United States and Asia, the country that was supposed to pull the rest of Europe forward is instead managing its own structural adjustment. Europe also faces a demographic reality that no short-term policy can address. Its working-age population is shrinking. Its pension obligations are rising, and the political will to make the difficult structural reforms needed, later retirement, more immigration, deeper capital market integration, is being consumed by the rise of populist movements that are thriving. Precisely because ordinary people feel the economic ground shifting beneath them, for ordinary European families, the crisis is not a dramatic single event. It is a slow erosion. Higher energy bills, stagnant wages, public services under budget pressure, and a growing suspicion that the economic promises made to their generation will not be kept. On the surface, China looks like a country that has crises under control. An authoritarian government with the ability to direct capital, manage information, and implement policy without the delays and compromises of democratic debate. A track record of engineering economic recoveries that Western analysts repeatedly underestimated. a foreign exchange reserve of over $3 trillion that provides a seemingly enormous buffer against external shocks. But underneath that surface of control, China is managing the confluence of three simultaneous crises, any one of which would be serious on its own, and which together represent the most significant economic challenge the People's Republic has and faced in its modern history. The first is the property crisis. China's property sector, which at its peak represented roughly 30% of GDP and was the primary store of wealth for the Chinese middle class, has been in a managed collapse since 2021. Over $300 billion in developer obligations remain unresolved. Tens of millions of apartments that families paid for years in advance have not been completed. The confidence destruction caused by this in the housing market, in the financial system, in the government's economic management is not something that can be reversed quickly by policy announcements. The second is the demand crisis. Chinese households, watching their primary asset property decline in value and facing genuine uncertainty about economic prospects, have responded by saving rather than spending. The household savings rate in China has risen to over 35%. That sounds prudent at the individual level, and at the national level, it is the opposite of what China's economy needs. Beijing wants Chinese consumers to spend and drive domestic growth. Chinese consumers are refusing. The third is the technology crisis. China's ambition to lead the world in artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and advanced manufacturing is running directly into a coordinated American-led campaign to deny it access to the chips and equipment needed to compete at the technology frontier. The restrictions on advanced semiconductor exports to China represent a deliberate attempt to slow its economic ascent. And they are working. For ordinary Chinese families, particularly the younger generation, facing 20% youth unemployment, evaporated property wealth, and an economic compact that is no longer delivering on its promises. This is not an abstract policy challenge. It is a daily lived reality of frustrated expectations. On the surface, the developing world is where the growth story of the 21st century is supposed to be unfolding. Young populations, abundant resources, rising middle classes, the demographic dividend that aging rich countries have lost. If you read the reports from international development institutions, the future belongs to Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. But underneath that optimistic narrative, the developing world is being hit by the current crisis with a force and a speed that the optimistic forecast did not account for. When American interest rates rise, the consequences do not stay in America. Capital that was flowing into developing country bonds and equities, attracted by higher yields in the era of near-zero U.S. rates, flows back out toward the safety of dollar assets. Developing country currencies weaken, import costs rise, inflation follows. Governments that borrowed in dollars during the cheap money era find their debt service costs rising sharply in local currency terms, and the ability of those governments to keep spending on the schools, hospitals, and infrastructure that their populations need is directly compromised. According to the International Monetary Fund, at least 60% of low-income countries are currently in debt distress or at high risk of it. Ghana, Zambia, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Ethiopia have already been forced to restructure their debts or seek emergency support. These are not failed states. These are countries that were following the rules of the international financial system, borrowing for development, integrating into global trade, implementing the policies recommended by international institutions, and are now facing a crisis caused largely by decisions made in Washington, Frankfurt, and Beijing. The human consequences are not abstractions. When a government runs out of foreign exchange, it cannot import fuel. When it cannot import fuel, hospitals go dark. Schools close. Food rots in transit. The decisions made in the capitals of powerful nations arrive on the doorsteps of ordinary families in Accra, Colombo, and Islamabad, as power cuts, empty shelves, and children who go to bed hungry. On the surface, the Gulf states look immune to the crisis, building elsewhere. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait are sitting on enormous sovereign wealth. Oil revenues, even at current prices, are generating surpluses. Unemployment in the Gulf is low, government services are generously funded, and the physical infrastructure of cities like Dubai and Riyadh is world-class. If you are looking for somewhere that feels insulated from global economic stress, the Gulf is it. But underneath that comfortable surface, the Gulf is facing a window of opportunity that is narrowing faster than most of its leaders publicly acknowledge. The global energy transition, the shift from fossil fuels to renewable electricity, is not happening as fast as its proponents hoped, but it is happening. The International Energy Agency projects that global oil demand will peak within this decade and begin a long structural decline. That decline may be gradual, but for economies built almost entirely on oil revenues, even a gradual decline in demand, combined with the pressure to keep prices competitive as new energy sources emerge, represents an existential challenge to the economic model that built everything the Gulf has. The Gulf states know this. Saudi Vision 2030, the UAE's diversification strategy, Qatar's investment in technology and sport. These are serious, well-funded attempts to build economic foundations that do not depend entirely on hydrocarbons, but the transition is harder than it looks. An economy built on oil revenues, on imported labor, and on government employment for citizens cannot be transformed into a diversified, innovation-driven economy in a decade. The human capital, the entrepreneurial culture, and the institutional frameworks required take generations to build. For the Gulf, the crisis is not today, it is the decade after next if diversification does not succeed. But the window for that diversification is closing, and the decisions made in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha over the next 10 years will determine whether the Gulf uses its remaining oil wealth to build something durable, or whether it is the last generation that enjoys the mirage. So now, let us zoom out and look at the biggest picture of all, because what we have just walked through, America's constrained toolkit, Europe's eroding foundations, China's triple crisis, the developing world's impossible position, and the Gulf's narrowing window, these are not isolated national stories. They are all symptoms of the same underlying condition. In 2008, the global economy had a heart attack. It was sudden, it was visible, and the world's governments responded with emergency surgery. They cut interest rates to zero, injected trillions into the financial system, and borrowed on a scale not seen since wartime. The patient survived. But the treatment left the patient weaker in specific ways that were not immediately apparent. Debt levels that were already high went dramatically higher. The interest rate lever, which had been the primary tool of economic management for decades, was essentially used up, and the institutional cooperation between major powers that made the 2008 response possible has since deteriorated significantly. What is building now is not a heart attack. It is a slow accumulation of chronic conditions: high debt, demographic decline, fractured trade, energy insecurity, technological disruption, geopolitical competition that individually are manageable but together create a systemic vulnerability that no single policy intervention can resolve. The patient is not in the emergency room. The patient is living with a set of conditions that are gradually reducing their capacity to function, that are making each new shock harder to absorb than the last, and that are accumulating towards a crisis point whose exact timing and trigger nobody can predict, but whose underlying logic is clear. The reason this crisis is harder to see than 2008 is precisely because it does not have a single moment of visible collapse. 2008 had Lehman Brothers. It had a date, September 15th, 2008, when you could point to something and say, that is when it started. What is building now does not have that moment yet. It has a slow accumulation of pressures that erode economic resilience gradually, that make governments progressively less capable of responding, and that hit ordinary people through the gradual deterioration of living standards rather than through a single dramatic event. That gradual deterioration is actually harder to respond to politically than a sudden crisis. A sudden crisis creates urgency, it creates the political will to do difficult things, to accept short-term pain for longer-term recovery, to cooperate across borders and across political divisions. A gradual deterioration does the opposite. It creates frustration without a clear target. It fuels political polarization. It rewards politicians who offer simple explanations and easy villains over those who offer complex truths and difficult solutions. And that political dynamic, the rise of populism, the retreat of international cooperation, the difficulty of building consensus for the structural reforms that are genuinely needed, is itself one of the biggest reasons why this crisis is so hard to escape. I want to end with the most surprising conclusion in this entire analysis, because the biggest single factor that will determine how this crisis unfolds is not the one that financial analysts are spending most of their time discussing. Most financial analysis of what is coming focuses on debt levels, interest rates, trade flows, and technology disruption. All of those things matter, but the factor that will matter most, the factor that will determine whether the current accumulation of pressures produces a managed, painful but survivable adjustment, or whether it produces something genuinely catastrophic, is institutional trust. You might expect me to say that the key variable is which country has the most resources, or which central bank has the best policy tools, or which government has the most fiscal space. Those things matter. But actually, no. The single most important variable is whether the institutions that are supposed to manage this crisis, central banks, governments, international financial organizations, and the relationships between major powers, so still have enough credibility and cooperation to function effectively when the pressure peaks. In 2008, those institutions worked. The Federal Reserve coordinated with the European Central Bank. The G20 produced genuine cooperative responses. International institutions functioned as intended. The trust was there when it was needed. So that trust is now significantly lower than it was in 2008. The relationship between America and China, the two largest economies on Earth, whose cooperation is essential to any functioning global response, is more adversarial today than at any point since the Cold War. The multilateral institutions that are supposed to coordinate global responses are underfunded, politically contested, and struggling for legitimacy. Here's the metaphor I want you to carry away. Economic crises are like fires. The fire itself, the debt, the defaults, the market crashes, is serious but often survivable. What determines whether a fire destroys everything or is contained is whether the fire brigade shows up, whether it is equipped, and whether the neighbors cooperate instead of arguing about whose fault the fire was while the house burns. So let us just recap what we covered today. America is entering this crisis with 3 times the debt it carried in 2008, interest rates that cannot easily be cut to zero again, and interest payments that are crowding out the very investments needed to sustain its economic strength. It will manage, but the management will be harder and more painful than 2008. Europe is running out of economic room. Its largest economies carry debt that is growing faster than their economies. Its industrial engine, Germany, is in a structural recession it has not yet found an answer to. And its political systems are under pressure from populations who feel the slow erosion of living standards but cannot identify a clear target for their frustration. China is managing the confluence of 3 simultaneous crises: a property sector collapse, a domestic demand drought, and an American-led campaign to restrict its technological ascent. Any one of these would be serious. Together, they represent the most difficult economic challenge in the People's Republic's modern history. The developing world is being hit hardest by a crisis it did not cause. by decisions made in capitals that do not fully reckon with the human consequences of their policies. 60% of low-income countries are in debt, distress, or at high risk. The development ladder is being pulled up just as they were beginning to climb. The Gulf states have the resources and the window to build something durable beyond oil. But that window is narrowing with every year that the energy transition advances. And the transformation required is harder and slower than the official narratives suggest. And the single most important variable in how this crisis unfolds is not debt levels or interest rates or trade flows. It is whether the institutional trust and international cooperation that contained the 2008 crisis can be rebuilt in time to manage what is coming. And tell me in the comments, do you think the world's major economies can cooperate to manage this crisis the way they did in 2008? Or do you think the breakdown in trust between America and China makes that kind of cooperation impossible? Time. I will see you next time.